That's not always the case. But I've learned throughout my life that preparation and truth can carry you far, can allow you to speak truth to power. I've learned that as a young Black girl growing up in the projects in Brooklyn, housing community on St. Croix, sent to the most unlikeliest of settings, and now as an adult woman representing an island territory speaking to the US Senate. And because of truth, I am confident today speaking before you, because truth and facts are overwhelming that our president, the President of the United States, incited a mob to storm the Capitol to attempt to stop the certification of a presidential election. My fellow managers have shown and will continue to show clear evidence that President Trump incited a violent mob to storm our Capitol when he ran out of nonviolent means to stop the election. Once assembled, that mob, at the president's direction, erupted into the bloodiest attack on this Capitol since 1814. Some of you have said there's no way the president could have known how violent the mob would be. That is false, because the violence, it was foreseeable. I want to show you why this violence was foreseeable and why Donald Trump was different than any other politician just telling their fighters, their supporters, to fight for something. The violence that occurred on January 6th, like the attack itself, did not just appear. You'll see that Donald Trump knew the people he was inciting. He saw the violence that they were capable of, and he had a pattern and practice of praising and encouraging that violence, never, ever condemning it. And you'll see that this violent attack was not planned in secret. The insurgents believed that they were doing the duty of their president. They were following his orders. And so they publicized it openly, loudly, proudly, exact blueprints of how the attack would be made. Law enforcement saw these postings and reported that these insurgents would violently attack the Capitol itself. This was not just a comment by an official to fight for a cause. This was months of cultivating a base of people who were violent, praising that violence, and then leading that violence, that rage, straight at our door. The point is this: by the time he called the cavalry of his thousands of supporters on January 6th, and an event he had invited them to, he had every reason to know that they were armed, that they were violent, and that they would actually fight. He knew who he was calling and the violence they were capable of. And he still gave that marching orders to go to the Capitol and, quote, fight like hell and stop the steal. Make no mistake, the violence was not just foreseeable to President Trump. The violence was what he deliberately encouraged. As early as September, Trump set the precedent that when asked to denounce violence, he would do the opposite and encourage it. Now, if the president had only said something once about fighting to stop the steal and violence erupted, there would be no way to know he intended to incite it or saw it coming. But just as the president spent months spreading his big lie of the election, he also spent months cultivating groups of people who, following his command, repeatedly engaged in real, dangerous violence. And when they did, when the violence erupted as a response to his calls to fight against the stolen election, he did not walk it back. He did not tell them no. He did the opposite. The opposite. He praised and encouraged the violence so that it would continue. He fanned the flame of violence, and it worked. You'll see this over time. These very groups and individuals whose violence the president praised helped lead the attack on January 6th. And that's how we know clearly that President Trump deliberately incited this, and how we know he saw it coming. There are many examples where the president engaged in this pattern, and I'm just going to walk you through a few of them. Let's start with the President Trump's incitement of the Proud Boys. Many of you have heard of this group, which since 2018 has been classified by the FBI as an extremist organization. Since that classification, the group has repeatedly engaged in serious acts of violence, including at pro-Trump rallies. And one such act, on September 7th, the Proud Boys attacked a man with a baseball bat and then punched him while he was down on the ground. On September 29th, during a presidential debate, President Trump was asked specifically if he was willing to condemn white supremacy and militia groups, if he was willing to tell them to stand down and stop the violence. Let's watch.
But are you willing tonight to condemn white supremacists and militia groups and to say that they need to stand down and not add to the violence in a number of these cities, as we saw in Kenosha and as we've seen in Portland?
Sure,
are you
I'm
prepared
willing to do
specifically
that, but
do it? Well, go
I would
ahead,
say,
sir.
Let's hear now the president's response.
Do it, sir.
say it, do it, say it. Do you want to call them, what do you want to call them? Give me a name, give me a
White
name.
supremacists and
Who would
right
you like me to condemn?
white supremacists and right
Proud
militia.
Boys, stand back and stand by.
When asked to condemn the Proud Boys and white supremacists, what did our president say? He said, stand back and stand by. His message was heard loud and clear. The group adopted that phrase, stand back and stand by, as their official slogan. They created merchandise with their new slogan, which they wore proudly across their backs at Trump's rallies, and they followed the president's orders. You'll see more about this later in the trial, but you'll see in these photos, to the left, Dominic Pezzola, and to the right, William Pepe, two of the leaders of the group, heading to the Capitol on January 6th. They were later charged with working together to obstruct law enforcement. As we go through this evidence, I want you to keep in mind these words by President Trump when asked to condemn violence. Stand back and stand by, and see example after example of the kinds of people like the Proud Boys who he had standing by on January 6th. By October, as my colleagues Mr. Castro and Mr. Swalwell showed you, Donald Trump was escalating his big lie that the only way he could lose the election was if it was rigged. So, as Election Day neared, his supporters were frustrated and they were angry. They were prepared to ensure his victory by any means necessary. One of these violent acts was on October 30th, sometime after 12:30 p.m. A caravan of more than 50 trucks covered in pro-Trump campaign gear confronted and surrounded cars carrying Biden-Harris campaign workers and a Biden-Harris campaign bus as they were traveling down Interstate 35 from San Antonio to Austin. According to witnesses, this caravan repeatedly tried to force the bus you saw and you see in that video to slow down in the middle of the highway and then to run it off the road. What that video you just saw does not show is that the bus that they tried to run off the road was filled with young campaign staff, volunteers, supporters, surrogates, people. As the Trump supporters closed in on the bus, a large black pickup truck adorned with Trump flags suddenly and intentionally swerved and crashed into a car driven by a Biden-Harris volunteer. News of the event went viral on social media. The President of the United States, in a campaign, saw his own supporters trying to run a bus carrying his opponent's campaign workers off the highway, to physically intimidate people in this country campaigning. Here was his response the next day.
3, 2, 1, go! Welcome to the Red Kingdom. Yeah. Red Kingdom. Welcome to the Red Kingdom. Yeah. Red Kingdom. Welcome to the place where we run it.
The President of the United States tweeted a video of his supporters trying to drive a bus off the road. You'll recall in that first video that I showed you, there was no sound. Well, the one that he tweeted had a fight theme song placed to it that the president put that music to that video. And he added at the top, "I love Texas." By the next evening, that tweet that he did had been viewed 12.6 million times. And it wasn't just a tweet. On November 1st, at a Michigan rally with a sea of supporters, the president talked about that incident again. Here it is.
Something. Do you see the way our people, they were protecting his bus yesterday because they're nice. So his bus, they had hundreds of cars. Trump, and the American flag. That's it. You see Trump and American flag.
The president made a public joke of violence against campaigners in an American election. He made light of it. This was not a joke. In fact, it was so violent, it put so many people in harm's way that the FBI investigated the incident and the criminal responsibility of those who attacked these campaign workers. Now, our President Donald Trump could have said, okay, I didn't realize how bad that was. This was very violent. Please stop. But he didn't. He saw the investigation and made a statement in defense of his supporters' attack on the bus, writing, quote, "In my opinion, these patriots did nothing wrong. Engaging in violence for him made them patriots to Donald Trump. For anyone who says Donald Trump didn't know the violence he was inciting, I ask you to consider his supporters tried to drive a bus off the highway in the middle of the day to intimidate his opponent's campaign workers. And his response was to tweet the video of the incident that had fight music, joke about it, and call those individuals in that incident patriots." And once again, Donald Trump's praise worked to incite them further. Emboldened by that praise, they remained ready to fight, ready to stand back and stand by. This link is not hypothetical. Just like we saw with the Proud Boys showing up in full force on January 6th, Donald Trump's encouragement of this attack made sure his supporters were ready for the next one. The caravan bus attack had been organized by a Trump supporter named Keith Lee. Leading up to the attack on our Capitol of January 6th, Mr. Lee teamed up with other supporters to fundraise to help to bring people to Washington, D.C. for that day. The morning of the attack, he filmed footage of the Capitol, pointed out the flimsiness of fencing, and then addressed his supporters before the attack saying, quote, "As soon as you all get done hearing the president, y'all get to the Capitol. We need to surround this place." During the attack, he used a bullhorn to call out for the mob to rush in. He later went to the rotunda himself and then back outside to urge the crowd to come inside. These are the people that President Trump cultivated, who were standing by. I'd like to look at another example. After the election on December 12th, Trump supporters gathered en masse to protest the stolen election in D.C. It was billed by his loyalists as the second Million MAGA March. The rally was organized by Women for America First. The same group that you'll see later secured the permit for the January 6th rally. And who else was there? The Proud Boys, standing by. Donald Trump did not attend that rally, but he made sure to make clear his supporters throughout the day how he felt about the event. At 8:47 a.m., he sent out a tweet. "We have just begun to fight." And then the rally began. And Donald Trump's allies, who spoke at the rally, carried on his message of the stolen election and the importance of fighting to stop the steal. Here's Nicholas Fuentes, a commentator who had organized a Stop the Steal rally in Michigan with Trump supporters.
In the first Million MAGA March, we promised that if the GOP would not do everything in their power to keep Trump in office, then we would destroy the GOP. And as we gather here in Washington, D.C. for a second Million MAGA March, we're done making promises. It has to happen now. We are going to destroy the GOP.
Let's go! Destroy the GOP! Destroy the GOP! Destroy the GOP!
Those words, that was Trump's message. Destroy anyone who won't listen, who won't help them take the election for Trump. And as you will see, this was just the preview for Fuentes, who, like the Proud Boys and the Trump caravan organizers, would later heed the president's call and come to Washington and be there on January 6th. Later in the rally, a former Trump campaign spokeswoman, Katrina Pearson, also spoke. During her speech, she stated, quote, "This isn't over. This is just beginning," referring to the fight to stop the steal. And then she added, "We knew both Republican and Democrats were against we the people. We are the cavalry. No one's coming for us." It's clear that Trump and some of his supporters saw this as war, a fight against anyone who was unwilling to do whatever it took to keep Donald Trump in power. We are the cavalry. And President Trump continued to reinforce his support of these messages throughout the day. At 1:48 p.m., after both speeches, he retweeted his deputy chief of staff's tweet showing his crowd that he had flown over on Marine One, and he tweeted, quote, "Thank you, patriots." These people were, as you can see, gathered en masse and being told by the president's allies that their election had been stolen. And they were told they were the cavalry. No one else could do it. And after hearing these speeches and seeing the president's support, this is what Donald Trump's cavalry was capable of.
What's up? tonight.
What you just saw was the violence that ensued after that rally. The Proud Boys, after that rally, engaged in serious acts of violence in downtown DC. Some Trump supporters and self-identified Proud Boys vandalized churches after that rally. If we look at these events, it's clear how we got here. Because what did the president do after that? He turned right around, and a little over a week later, he began coordinating the January 6th Save America rally with the same people who had planned the Second Million MAGA March. You'll recall that the Women for America First had organized that Second Million MAGA March. They had originally planned rallies for January 22nd and January 23rd, after the inauguration. But Donald Trump had other plans. On December 19th, President Trump tweeted his save the date for January 6th. He told his supporters to come to DC for a big protest, the day billing it as wild. Just days later, Women for America First amended their permit to hold their rally on January 6th, pursuant to the president's save the date, instead of after the inauguration. This was deliberate. Reports confirm that the president himself, President Trump, became directly involved with the planning of the event, including the speaking lineup, even the music to be played, just as he chose the music for his retreat of the caravan driving the Biden-Harris bus off the road with that fight song. And he brought the same people who spoke at the Second Million MAGA rally to help as well. Trump's campaign advisor, Katrina Pearson, who you recall said on December 12th that this is only the beginning, we are the cavalry, also became directly involved in planning the event. They even sent out invitations together. This is Amy Kremer, one of the founders of Women for America First, tweeting the invitation, tagging Donald Trump and other organizers, inviting the same supporters who had just engaged in serious violence at the Second Million MAGA rally to show up to the largest rally to stop the steal. And President Trump seemed to have other plans for what was going to happen at that rally, too. Women for America First had initially planned for the rally-goers to remain at the Ellipse until the counting of the state electoral slates was completed, just like they had remained at Freedom Plaza after the Second Million MAGA March. In fact, the permit stated in no uncertain terms that the march from the Ellipse was not permitted. It was not until after President Trump and his team became involved in the planning that the march from the Ellipse to the Capitol came about, in direct contravention of the original permit. This was not a coincidence. None of this was. Donald Trump, over many months, cultivated violence, praised it, and then when he saw the violence his supporters were capable of, he channeled it to his big, wild, historic event. He organized January 6th with the same people that had just organized a rally, resulting in substantial violence, and made absolutely sure this time these violent rally-goers wouldn't just remain in place. He made sure that those violent people would literally march right here to our steps, from the Ellipse to the Capitol, to stop the steal. His cavalry. This was deliberate. And because the President of the United States incited this, because he was orchestrating this, because he was inviting them, the insurgents were not shy about their planning. They believed they were following the orders of the commander-in-chief. They were, as the tweet we just saw, quite literally his cavalry. So they posted exact blueprints of the attack openly, loudly, proudly. And they did this all over public forums. These were not just hidden posts in dark websites that Trump would not have seen, quite the opposite. We know that President Trump's team monitored these websites. We know this because his advisors confirm it. An ex-White House and campaign insider, as you'll read, who has known both Scavino and the president for years, said there was no way that Scavino and the Trump social media operation would not have been aware of the plan circulating online to storm the Capitol. Because, and I quote, "The Trump operation closely monitored the web's darkest corners, ranging from mainstream sites such as Twitter, Facebook, and Reddit, to fringe message boards like 4chan and XChan, now called XCon, to the Donald.win, an offshoot of a banned Reddit community dedicated to rabidly supporting all things Trump." They actively monitored the exact sites, like the Donald.win, on which these insurrectionists wrote their posts. And so what would Trump and his team have seen when they were monitoring these white sites? What would his supporters have said? They would have seen a clear roadmap of exactly what happened. This is an example of a post that was captured from one of the sites dedicated to Donald Trump that we just talked about, shortly before the site was taken down. And the meme reads, quote, "The Capitol is our goal. Everything else is a distraction. Every corrupt member of Congress locked in one room and surrounded by real Americans is an opportunity that will never present itself again." Let that sink in. Think about that. The exact thing that happened on January 6th, that was their goal. And they said it out loud on sites that the Trump administration was actively monitoring. A third-party site captured a post on the Donald.win where one user posted, quote, "This cannot simply be a protest. It has to be the establishment of the MAGA militia with the command offices set up, with all further militia tactical missions spreading from there." Another user said in response, quote, "We will have to achieve an actual tactical victory, like storming and occupying the Capitol, to have the intended effect." That's what they understood Donald Trump to want. There it is in black and white. And they explained why they felt justified in this. Another poster on the forum, the Donald.win, wrote on January 4th, quote, "If Congress illegally certifies Biden, Trump would have absolutely no choice but to demand us to storm Congress and kill/beat them up. Donald Trump will have no choice." That was what he made them believe, to the point his supporters felt justified even in carrying weapons and storming our Capitol. This was in post after post. Here's another. When discussing how to carry guns into D.C., one noted, quote, "Yes, it's illegal, but this is war, and we are clearly in a post-legal phase of our society." What? They treated it as a war, and they meant it. The morning of the attack, under the thread, "Today I told my kids goodbye," one poster wrote, "Today I had the very difficult conversation with my children that Daddy might not come home from D.C. Within a matter of hours, that post amassed 4,000 likes. President Trump had truly made them believe that their election had been stolen and that it was their patriotic duty to fight to steal it back. Patriotic, a term he gave those who use violence for him, and they were willing to say goodbye to their children for this fight. And their supporters didn't just rely on entering the Capitol with guns haphazardly. They had maps of this building. They talked through which tunnels to use and how to get to the Senate chamber. Some posted specific floor plans, layouts of the Capitol, alongside hopes of overwhelming law enforcement to, quote, find the tunnels, arrest the worst traitors. Posters also fixated on what they saw as their ability to easily overwhelm the Capitol Police, as, quote, there are only around 2,000 of them. And again, they urge, quote, the Capitol is our goal. Everything else is a distraction. There were hundreds of these posts, hundreds, monitored by the Trump administration. And these posts, they were chillingly accurate, right down to communication devices. A new affidavit filed by the FBI described preparations by the right-wing group, the Proud Boys, to storm the Capitol, including using earpieces and walkie-talkies to direct movements throughout the building. This happened. That's the level of planning in advance that occurred. They had earpieces. On the slide, you'll see Proud Boy member Dominic Pizzola has an earpiece in his right ear, consistent with the affidavit. And in addition to these detailed posts, they made clear why they thought they should do this, why they thought they could do this. It wasn't just that they were doing it to following the president's orders. They thought he would help them. A third-party site captured a post on the Donald.win again, the site monitored by Trump's team, and he wrote, quote, he, meaning Donald Trump in this instance, can order the Nat Guard to stand down if needed. Unfortunately, he has no control over the Capitol Police, but there are only around 2,000 of them, and a lot are useless fat asses or girls. It's all right there. The overall goal, maps of the Capitol, the weapons, communication devices. They even said publicly, openly, proudly, that President Trump will help them to commandeer the National Guard, so all they have to do is overwhelm the 2,000 Capitol Police officers. This was reported in the NBC News and the Washington Post with headlines like, violent threats ripple through far-right internet forums ahead of protests. Pro-Trump forums erupt with violent threats ahead of Wednesday's rally against the 2020 election. Fox News also reported that the Proud Boys would come to the January 6th rally prepared for violent action, even quoting a Proud Boy member who said they would, quote, incognito and spread across downtown DC in smaller numbers. City officials, seeing these same warnings, also publicly warned about the violence and unlawful weapons at the event. DC Mayor Muriel Bowser cautioned residents of the District of Columbia to avoid the downtown area while the rally attendees were in town. Federal law enforcement warned of these threats also. On January 3rd, a Capitol Police intelligence report warned of a violent scenario in which Congress itself could be the target of the angry supporters of President Trump on January 6th. According to that report, obtained by the Washington Post, supporters of the current president see January 6, 2021, as the last opportunity to overturn the results of the presidential election. This sense of desperation and disappointment may lead to more incentive to become violent. Unlike previous post-election protests, the targets of the pro-Trump supporters are not necessarily the counter-protesters as they were previously, but rather Congress itself is the target for January 6th. The day before the rioters stormed the Congress, an FBI office in Virginia also issued an explicit warning that extremists were preparing to travel to Washington to commit violence and, quote, war, according to internal reports. The FBI report cited to an online post where the user declared that Trump supporters should go to Washington and get violent. The supporter said, quote, "Stop calling this a march or a rally or a protest. Go there ready for war. We get our president or we die." These threat warnings were not just hypothetical. Actual arrests occurred in the days leading to the attack. On January 4th, 2 days before the rally, one extremely well-publicized arrest was of a Proud Boy leader who destroyed a church's Black Lives Matter banner a month earlier during the December 12th Second Million MAGA March. Report emphasized that when he was arrested, he was carrying high-capacity firearm magazines, which he claimed were meant to be supplied to another rally attendee for January 6th. By the night of January 6th attack, DC police had already made 6 arrests in connection with the planned protests on charges of carrying weapons, ammunitions, assaulting police. This is all in public view, all of it. The truth is usually seen and rarely heard. Truth is truth, whether denied or not. And the truth is, President Trump had spent months calling his supporters to a march on a specific day, at a specific time, in specific places to stop the certification. And leading up to the event, there were hundreds of posts online showing that his supporters took this as a call to arms to attack the Capitol. There were detailed posts of plans to attack online. Law enforcement warned that these posts were real threats and even made arrests days leading up to the attack. And yet, in the face of all this, these credible warnings of serious, dangerous threats to our Capitol, when those thousands of people were standing in front of President Trump, ready to take orders and attack, this is what he said: "We're going to the Capitol, and we fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore." And that's why this is different. And that's why he must be convicted and disqualified.
Representative Dean will now return to the events of January 6th itself. She will demonstrate President Trump's repeated incitement of the crowd that morning as he directed them to the Capitol in his last-ditch effort to retain his hold on power.
For me and for many Americans, January 6th is forever etched in our memories. I went to work with a sense of excitement, the start of my second term in Congress, and the first time I would participate in the certification of a presidential election. And then we all know what happened. I know many of us have similar experiences from that day, but I'll briefly share mine. I stood with colleagues in the gallery above the House floor to observe the Arizona challenge. Moments later, police radios reported a breach of the Capitol grounds. Someone shouted up to us, "Duck, then lie down, then ready your gas masks." Shortly after, there was a terrifying banging on the chamber doors. I will never forget that sound. Shouts and panicked calls to my husband and to my sons, instructions to flee, and then the constant worrying